Gavin Newsom walked into a Senate hearing, expecting a presidential coronation. But J.D. Vance used a single piece of paper to brutally dismantle his political career on live television. Rapid B-roll, montage. Gavin Newsom walked into the Senate hearing room like a man auditioning for the presidency. J.D. Vance treated him like one and spent the next 2 hours explaining, line by line, why his resume didn't survive the interview. Gavin Newsom entered room 216 of the Hart Senate office building the way he entered every room, as if the room had been built for the occasion of his arrival. The suit was charcoal, $3,200, tailored to a body that had been maintained with the discipline of a man who understood that, in American politics, the body is the first page of the resume. The hair was immaculate. The smile was calibrated, warm enough to suggest accessibility, controlled enough to suggest command. Behind him, a communications team of 6 occupied the second row, 2 staffers on laptops, 1 videographer, 1 press secretary with a phone in each hand, and 2 advisors whose sole function was to monitor the hearing in real time and draft social media responses within 90 seconds of any quotable moment. Newsom had come to Washington prepared for a fight. His podcast had dropped a new episode the week before, Why California Works, and his team had pre-written 3 tweets and a post-hearing statement, all variations on the same message. Governor stands up to partisan attacks, defends California's record. The hearing was supposed to be theater, and Newsom was good at theater. He had been good at it since his first mayoral campaign in San Francisco, when he learned that the camera rewards confidence more than competence, and that confidence in politics is competence's most convincing substitute. Across the dais, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio sat behind a single sheet of paper, not a binder, not a folder, not a stack of documents. One sheet, printed on standard letter-size paper, with a heading that Newsom could not yet read from his witness chair. Vance did not look up when Newsom entered. He was writing something in the margin of the paper, a small red mark, the kind made by a fine-tipped pen, the kind that teachers use on exams and hiring managers use on applications. When the hearing was called to order, Vance looked up for the first time. He did not smile. He did not offer the performative courtesy that senators typically extend to high-profile witnesses, the thank you for being here that functions as a handshake and a warning in equal measure. He simply held up the paper so that the camera could see the heading. It read, Governor Gavin Newsom, Executive Summary for National Leadership. Governor, Vance said, you want to be President of the United States. Everyone in this room knows it. Everyone watching knows it. Your podcast is called This is Gavin Newsom. You've visited New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Iowa in the last 6 months. You spoke at Davos. You're rerunning. Newsom started to respond, Senator, I'm here to discuss California's governor. I'm not criticizing your ambition. Vance interrupted. Ambition is fine. The presidency should be open to anyone who believes they requalified. But qualification requires scrutiny. And today, I want to treat you the way any serious candidate should be treated as an applicant. He tapped the paper. This is your resume. I compiled it from your campaign website, your public statements, your State of the State addresses, and your Davos remarks. These are the things you say you've done. Today, I'm going to go through them one by one, and at the end, we'll see whether this resume passes the interview. 2 hours later, every line on that paper would have a red mark beside it. Newsom would leave the room through the side exit without stopping at the camera bank where his press secretary had been holding a position since before the hearing began. And the resume, the single sheet that Vance left face down on the witness table, would be photographed by a Reuters correspondent who happened to be standing nearby. The photo would have 22 million views before the evening news aired. Governor, the first line of your resume says, and I am quoting directly from your Davos remarks, that you managed the world as fifth largest economy. Vance began. That is California's GDP, approximately $4.1 trillion. It is an impressive number. I want to give you credit for it. Vance looked at the paper, then at Newsom. But managing an economy means managing the systems that make it function. The regulatory environment, the tax collection, the distribution of public funds, the agencies that process payments, issue benefits, and enforce compliance. Those are the systems that a governor manages. So, let me look at the management record. Your chief of staff, from 2022 to 2024, was Dana Williamson. In November 2025, she was indicted by federal prosecutors for allegedly siphoning campaign and COVID-19 recovery funds into her own accounts and those of an associate. Two of her co-defendants have already struck plea deals that reportedly confirmed the scheme's existence. He let the facts sit. 1 second. 2. 3. Governor, your chief of staff, the person you chose to manage your office, your schedule, your legislative agenda, the person who sat in meetings where policy decisions were made on behalf of 39 million people, was indicted for financial misconduct 11 months after leaving your office. She was not a low-level staffer. She was not an obscure appointee. She was your chief of staff. During your tenure, the Employment Development Department, the agency that processes unemployment claims, lost an estimated $33 billion to FR at UD. $33 billion. That's the annual budget of Oregon. Criminal actors were so confident in the system's inability to catch them that a Memphis rapper named Fontrell Baines released a music video in which he held up EDD envelopes and bragged about filing false claims. The song was called EDD. He rapped, "You got to sell C0 cane. I just file a claim." He filed over $700,000 in fraudulent claims before he was caught. The United States Department of Health and Human Services has estimated, and this is their estimate, Governor, not mine, that California's medical program has had a FR at UD rate of approximately 25% since 2019. 1 in 4. California has roughly 15 million medical enrollees. At that rate, the potential financial exposure is in the tens of billions. Your state auditor has labeled 7 state agencies high risk for waste, FR at UD, or inefficiency. 2 of those agencies have been on the list since 2007. Governor, you've been in statewide office for most of them. Not one has been removed from the list. And in 2025, your legislature introduced a bill to raise the felony threshold for welfare FR at UD from $950 to $25,000. Not to lower it, to raise it. To make it harder to prosecute the FR at UD that was already running rampant through every system you managed. He picked up his pen and drew a small red mark next to the first line of the resume. Governor, that's on your resume. Newsom leaned into his microphone. He was not rattled. Gavin Newsom did not rattle in hearing rooms. He had been performing in public since before Vance was in law school. Senator, California processes more government transactions than any state in America. More unemployment claims, more medical enrollees, more of everything, because we are the largest state in the Union. FAITHAR at UD is a national problem. Every state experienced EDD losses during the pandemic, and Dana Williamson's actions were her own. I held her accountable the moment the allegations surfaced. It was a smooth answer, practiced, polished, delivered with the particular cadence that Newsom used when he wanted to sound both reasonable and firm. It acknowledged the problem while distributing blame. Vance responded without pause. Governor, you said you held Williamson accountable the moment the allegations surfaced. Let me check that against the timeline. Williamson served in your office until December 2024. The federal indictment was filed in November 2025, 11 months after she left. If you held her accountable, you did so retroactively, from a distance, nearly a year after she was no longer in your employ. That's not accountability, Governor. That's timing. And you said, this is a national problem. You'll rewrite, it is. Every state experienced EDD losses during the pandemic. So, let's compare. Texas lost approximately $8 billion. New York lost approximately $11 billion. Florida lost approximately $5 billion. California lost $33 billion. You are the largest state, I'll grant that. But California is not 3 times the size of Texas. You're about 50% larger. The loss was not proportional to your population. It was proportional to your systems. The systems that processed claims without verification, that sent debit cards to prison inmates, that were so porous a rapper could brag about exploiting them on YouTube. But it's not just the EDD, Governor. The FRAR at UD spans agencies. Your medical program has an estimated 25% exposure rate. CalFresh, your food assistance program, has documented losses in the hundreds of millions. Your state auditor has labeled 7 agencies high risk. 2 of them have been on that list since 2007, before the iPhone, before Twitter, before your first term. They were broken when you arrived. They are still broken. And the legislative response? Your legislature didn't propose cracking down. They proposed raising the felony threshold from $950 to $25,000, not lowering it, raising it. That's not reform. That's surrender. That is the government saying, we cannot stop it. So let us redefine it. He picked up his pen and drew a red mark next to the first line of the resume. The pen scratched the paper. A small sound that the microphone caught. Governor, that S. On your resume. Vance turned the paper slightly, moving to the second line. His movements were precise, unhurried, the movements of a man who had studied the material so thoroughly that he could recite it without looking, but who looked anyway, because the act of reading carried more authority than the act of speaking from memory. Governor, the second line of your resume says you led the nation on climate action and clean energy transition. You said this at Davos in January. You cited 2.5 million electric vehicles purchased in California. You positioned yourself as the counterweight to Washington on environmental policy. Let me check that. In July 2025, 6 months after Davos, you reversed your own energy policies. You backed increased in-state oil production. You abandoned your proposed cap on oil industry profits. Why? Because refineries were shutting down under the regulatory pressure your policies created. Because gasoline hit $6 a gallon. Because your constituents, the ones who can't afford electric vehicles, the ones who drive used Camrys to 2 jobs, were choosing between a full tank and a full refrigerator. Your electricity rates are 32 cents per kilowatt hour. The national average is 17. Your residents pay nearly double. And the 2.5 million electric vehicles you bragged about at Davos charge on an electrical grid that your own utilities have publicly warned cannot handle peak demand. In August 2025, the California Independent System Operator issued a flex alert, asking residents to reduce electricity usage between 4:00 and 9:00 p.m. to avoid blackouts. You're selling electric cars and rationing the electricity to charge them. He looked up. And then there's the high-speed rail. Your signature infrastructure project, promised as a San Francisco to Los Angeles corridor that would transform California transportation, current estimated cost $135 billion, original estimate $33 billion. It is decades behind its construction schedule, and the segment currently under construction connects Merced to Bakersfield. With respect to the residents of those cities, that is not the San Francisco to Los Angeles corridor that voters approved in 2008. The Daily Show described it as a futuristic bullet train that will take people from the thriving hub of Merced all the way to the shining metropolis of Bakersfield. The joke was funny because the joke was accurate. You also claimed in 2020 that CAL FIRE had treated 90,000 acres with fuel breaks and prescribed burns to reduce wildfire risk. The actual number, verified by state records, was 11,399 acres. You overstated the acreage by 690%. 690%, Governor. That's not a rounding error. That's not a misunderstanding. If a student overstated a number by 690% on an exam, they would fail. If a CEO overstated a number by 690% in an earnings report, they would be investigated by the SEC. You overstated it by 690% in a press release about public safety, about protecting people's homes from fire, and nobody was held accountable. And then the fires came. January 2025. The Los Angeles wildfires that destroyed neighborhoods, killed residents, and displaced thousands of families. The criticism was immediate and bipartisan. Insufficient water infrastructure, inadequate fire preparedness, years of deferred maintenance on systems that were supposed to prevent exactly what happened. You blamed climate change. Climate change is real. But climate change did not decide to overstate the fuel break acreage by 690%. Climate change did not defer the infrastructure investment. A government did. Your government. And the high-speed rail. Governor. This is the project you cite more than any other as evidence of your infrastructure vision. Let me read the numbers. Original voter-approved estimate, $33 billion. Current estimate, $135 billion, a 309% increase. Original completion timeline, 2020. Current projected completion, no firm date. The segment currently under construction runs from Merced to Bakersfield, which is, with respect to the residents of those cities, not the transformational San Francisco to Los Angeles corridor that California voters approved in 2008. The Daily Show described it as a bullet train that would take people from the thriving hub of Merced all the way to the shining metropolis of Bakersfield. The joke was funny because the joke was accurate. And when a comedy show can describe your signature infrastructure project more accurately than your press office, that is a management problem. Meanwhile, at Davos, you bragged about 2.5 million electric vehicles sold in California. You positioned this as evidence of climate leadership, but those 2.5 million vehicles charge on an electrical grid that your own California Independent System Operator has warned cannot handle peak demand. In August 2025, CAISO issued a flex alert asking residents to reduce electricity usage between 4:00 and 9:00 ppm to avoid rolling blackouts. You are selling electric cars and rationing the electricity to charge them. That is not a transition. That is a contradiction. Red mark. The pen scratched the paper. That is on your resume, Governor. Governor, when you ran for this office in 2018, you made a promise. You said you would build 3.5 million new homes by 2025. That promise was central to your campaign. It was on your website. It was in your ads. It was the number you gave voters when they asked how you would address the housing crisis. You built 640,000 homes. Vance paused. Let the number exist in the room alone. 640,000 out of 3.5 million. That is 18%. When reporters asked about the gap, a gap of nearly 3 million homes, you described your original promise as a stretch goal. Governor, a stretch goal is what a gym teacher sets for a middle schooler running the mile. It is not what a governor says about housing for 39 million people. You didn't miss a stretch goal. You made a promise, failed to deliver 82% of it, and then renamed the promise so that the failure sounded intentional. That is not a communication strategy. That is the language of someone who does not believe they will be held accountable for what they said. Meanwhile, your administration has spent $37 billion on homelessness over the past 6 years. The result? Homelessness in California has increased by 31.6%. California has 12% of the nation's population and 1/3 of the nation's homeless population. You have spent more per homeless person than any governor in American history. And homelessness has gotten worse. Your housing-first approach, which is the policy framework guiding that $37 billion, specifically prohibits funding from going to programs that require sobriety or mental health treatment as a condition of receiving housing, which means you are funding programs that are structurally unable to address the two primary causes of chronic homelessness, addiction, and untreated mental illness. You have designed a policy that cannot solve the problem it was created to solve, and you have spent $37 billion on it. And in August 2024, you personally visited a homeless encampment in Los Angeles. You cleared it on camera without notifying the city. It was excellent television, and it changed nothing, because an encampment clearance is a photo opportunity, not a housing policy. Newsom's rebuttal was his strongest moment of the hearing. His voice carried the controlled frustration of a man defending a record he believes has been fundamentally mischaracterized by people who have never governed anything larger than a Senate office. Homelessness is a national crisis, Senator. It's driven by decades of federal disinvestment in public housing, the deinstitutionalization of mental health facilities that began in the Reagan era, a housing market that has been broken since before I took office, and an opioid epidemic that has devastated every state in this country. I have invested more in combating homelessness than any governor in the history of the United States. More than any governor, in any state, in any era. And the states you would point to as alternatives, Florida, Texas, don't solve homelessness. They criminalize it. They arrest people for sleeping on sidewalks. They move them from one city to the next. That's not a solution. That's cruelty with a badge and a bus ticket. It was strong. The structural argument was legitimate. The criticism of criminalization was substantive. Several members of the hearing audience nodded. The gallery shifted slightly in Newsom's direction. Vance waited. He waited the way he always waited, not for dramatic effect, but because patience is the auditor's primary tool. The longer the silence after a defense, the more the defense begins to sound like what it is: an explanation of why the failure was someone else's fault. Governor, you said Florida criminalizes homelessness. Let me check the results of that approach against yours. He looked at his paper. Florida's homelessness has decreased under the approach you call cruel. California's homelessness has increased under the approach you call compassionate. Both approaches exist. Both have results. One produced outcomes, yours produced spending. And Governor, you said you invested more than any governor in history. That's true. You spent $37 billion, and homelessness increased by 31.6%. In every other field of human endeavor, in business, in medicine, in engineering, in any discipline where results are measured, if you spent more money than anyone in history and the problem got demonstrably worse, you would not cite the spending as a qualification. You would cite it as a failure. The $37 billion is not your defense, Governor, it is the indictment. Because $37 billion that produced a 31.6% increase is not investment, it is waste at scale. And waste at scale is exactly what a president cannot afford. Red mark, that's on your resume, Governor. Governor, the fourth line of your resume, and the line you lead with in every national interview, is that you stood up to the Trump administration and defended democratic values. I'm going to set aside the question of whether that's true, and instead examine something more specific, your positions. Let me read your stated positions on Israel in chronological order. He looked at the paper. September 2025. You told reporters you had deep reverence for Israel. October 2025. You distanced yourself from AIPAC, calling it not relevant to your day-to-day life. February 2026. You said you would not accept donations from AIPAC and never had. Track AIPAC, a non-partisan monitoring organization, immediately published records showing that you are, in fact, a former AIPAC donor. March 2026. You described Israel as sort of an apartheid state. Later that same week, you backtracked, saying you were describing Israel's potential trajectory, not its current status. 5 positions in 6 months, Governor. Deep reverence, distance, denial of a relationship that records prove existed, an accusation of apartheid, a retraction of that accusation. Governor, that's not evolution. Evolution implies direction. Your positions on Israel don't move in a direction, they move in a circle. Each change corresponds to a shift in your target audience. California progressives in September, National Jewish donors in October, New Hampshire primary voters in February, South Carolina activists in March. Your positions don't follow principles. They follow itineraries. And the pattern is not unique to Israel. It spans your entire record. Energy. You campaigned as the anti-fossil fuel governor. 6 years of executive orders, regulatory pressure, press conferences about clean energy. Then, in July 2025, when refineries started shutting down and gas hit $6 a gallon, you reversed. You backed in-state oil production. You abandoned the profit cap you'd threatened for years. You described the reversal as adapting to changing conditions. Governor, weather adapts to changing conditions. Leaders hold positions that survive them. Minimum wage. You signed a $20 per hour minimum wage for fast food workers, your signature economic policy. You held a ceremony, and buried in the legislative language was an exemption for restaurants that bake and sell bread as a standalone menu item. The largest Panera Bread franchisee in California is Greg Flynn. Greg Flynn has donated over $100,000 to your campaigns. When reporters connected the exemption to the donor relationship, your office initially denied any connection, then acknowledged the exemption existed, then said it was unrelated to any donor. 3 responses: deny, acknowledge, redefine. The same 3-step process you've used on Israel, on energy, on every inconvenient fact. Immigration. You positioned yourself as the nation's leading sanctuary state advocate. You signed legislation, you gave speeches, you sued the federal government, and then, in September 2025, when Assembly Bill 1840, which would have extended state housing assistance to undocumented immigrants, reached your desk, you vetoed it. The bill was perfectly aligned with the values you had spent 6 years campaigning on. You vetoed it because 2028 polling showed that immigration generosity was a liability in swing states, because the principle was expendable when the itinerary required it. Governor, your resume doesn't show consistency. It shows a man who holds every position at the right time, and no position at the wrong time. In meteorology, that phenomenon is called weather. It changes direction based on conditions, without agency or conviction. In politics, it has a different name, but I'll be polite, Governor, and call it weather. Red mark. That's on your resume, Governor. The hearing room had undergone the particular transformation that occurs when an audience realizes collectively that they are watching something they will remember. At the beginning, during the financial FR at UD section, the room had been attentive but skeptical, the way audiences are when a senator attacks a governor from the opposing party. By the energy section, the skepticism had faded, replaced by the focused attention of people following a logical argument to its conclusion. By the housing section, the attention had deepened into something closer to discomfort. The discomfort of watching a record dismantled by its own data, by the governor's own words, by the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. Now, as Vance turned to the fifth and final section of the resume, the room was quiet in the particular way that rooms become quiet when everyone present knows the ending but wants to hear it said aloud anyway. Newsom's communications team in the second row had stopped typing. 2 of the 6 staffers were looking at their phones, not posting, just reading. The third was looking at the floor. The videographer had lowered his camera. Vance picked up the resume. He held it in one hand, the red marks visible from the gallery, a column of small, precise notations running down the left margin, like grades on an exam that had not gone well. 4 red marks, 4 lines, 4 failures documented in the governor's own data, measured against the governor's own claims. Governor, let me read back what we've discussed today. Line 1 managed the world's 5th largest economy. Your chief of staff was indicted for financial misconduct. Your unemployment agency lost $33 billion. Your medical system has an estimated 25% exposure rate. 7 state agencies are designated high risk. The total financial exposure during your tenure has been estimated at $180 billion. Line 2. Led on climate and clean energy. You reversed your own energy policies when they made gas unaffordable. Your electricity costs are double the national average. Your signature rail project costs $135 billion and connects 2 cities that were not in the original proposal. You overstated wildfire prevention acreage by 690%. Line 3 built housing and fought homelessness. You promised 3.5 million homes and built 640,000. You spent $37 billion on homelessness, and homelessness increased by 31.6%. You called the housing gap a stretch goal. Line 4 stood up to Trump and defended democratic values. You changed your position on Israel 5 times in 6 months. You exempted a major donor from the minimum wage law you signed for everyone else. You vetoed an immigration bill that aligned with the values you campaigned on. He set the paper down. Governor, this is your resume. These are the accomplishments you present to the American people as qualifications for the presidency. And I have one question. Just one. It's the question that every voter in this country, Democrat, Republican, Independent, deserves an answer to. If you couldn't manage 39 million people successfully, if the systemic losses happened on your watch, if the homelessness increased under your programs, if the housing wasn't built, if the promises became stretch goals, why should 330 million people trust you with their country? The room was silent. The particular silence of a question that has no good answer. Not because the witness is stupid or inarticulate, but because the question was built from the witness's own record. And the record does not have a rebuttal. It only has an explanation. And explanations in an interview are not the same as answers. Newsom leaned into his microphone, and when he spoke, he pivoted to the pivot that had sustained his career to the rhetorical maneuver that had worked in every interview, every debate, every press conference for the past 7 years. Senator, I am the one who has stood up to this administration. I'm the one who has fought for California's values while Washington tried to dismantle them. You can cherry-pick numbers all day long, but the people of California know, Governor. Vance's voice was quiet, not loud, not sharp. Quiet, the way a door closes when it's being closed for the last time. I didn't ask about the administration. I didn't ask about Washington. I asked about you, about your record, about the numbers on this paper. And I want to point something out to the people watching. For the last 2 hours, every time I have asked about your record, about the mismanagement, about the homelessness, about the housing, about the flip-flops, you have responded by talking about Donald Trump. Every time. The failures? Trump's fault. The homelessness? Federal failure? The energy reversal? Fighting Trump's agenda? Governor, Donald Trump is not on your resume. Your results are on your resume, and you have spent this entire hearing avoiding them. He placed the resume face down on the table between them. The red marks were no longer visible. The paper was just a white rectangle on a wooden surface. Unremarkable, anonymous. The kind of document that gets thrown away after an interview. Thank you, Governor. I think the interview is over. Newsom stood. He buttoned his jacket. The practiced gesture, the automatic muscle memory of a man who had stood up from thousands of witness chairs and debate podiums, but he did not walk toward the camera bank. He did not stop to deliver the post-hearing soundbite his team had prepared. He turned to his left, said something to a staffer that was inaudible to the microphones, and left through the side exit. His press secretary, who had been holding a position near the camera bank since before the hearing began, phone in hand, tweet preloaded, watched him leave. She looked at the phone, then she locked it. The tweet, Governor Newsom defends California's record against partisan attacks, would never be sent. It had been written for a hearing that had gone differently than this one. Vance remained seated for several minutes. He spoke briefly to a colleague, made a note on a separate pad, and then stood and left through the main exit. He did not speak to reporters. He did not offer a victory statement. He walked to the elevator with his hands in his pockets, and the single sheet of paper, a clean copy, unmarked, folded in his jacket. The marked copy remained on the table. A Reuters photographer, passing through the hearing room while the staff cleared chairs, noticed the paper. She picked it up, saw the red marks, and understood immediately what she was holding. She photographed it on the table. The white paper, the red ink, the wood grain of the witness table visible underneath. The photo was transmitted to the Reuters wire at 4:47 p.m. By 6:00 p.m. It had 22 million views. By midnight, it was the most shared image from any congressional hearing in 2026. The image of the resume became the story's signature artifact. The way Kennedy's pencil and Johnson's gavel had become signatures of their respective confrontations. But the resume operated differently. A pencil is a symbol. A gavel is an instrument. A resume is a document. And documents can be read, shared, annotated, and most importantly, compared against reality. The image invited verification. Viewers looked at the red marks and checked the claims. The claims checked out. That S on your resume, Governor. 4 instances, 1 per round, became a meme format within 48 hours. The structure a politician's claim on top, the contradicting evidence below, the phrase at the bottom, applied to candidates, CEOs, university presidents, anyone whose public claims exceeded their documented results. The format was simple, replicable, and devastating because it required no opinion. It required only a claim and a fact. The stretch goal clip, Vance reading Newsom's own words back to him, traveled separately and further. The clip was shared by accounts across the political spectrum because the humor was self-evident. A man who promised 3.5 million homes, built 640,000, and called the difference aspirational. No commentary was needed. The words did the work. But the closing clip was the one that changed the trajectory. Vance saying, "For the last 2 hours, every time I asked about your record, you talked about Trump." It was devastating. Not because it was mean, it wasn't too, but because every viewer could verify it. They had watched the same 2 hours. They had heard the same pivots. And Vance's observation, once spoken, could not be unheard because it described something that had been happening in plain sight. Gretchen Whitmer issued a statement that was 5 words long. The governor can speak for himself. In political communication, declining to defend a colleague who is under fire is the first step in replacing them. The statement said everything by containing nothing. It did not defend Newsom's record. It did not challenge Vance's numbers. It did not offer the kind of full-throated solidarity that presidential rivals extend to each other when the damage is survivable. The damage Whitmer's 5 words implied was not survivable. Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania governor, the other leading 2028 contender, the man whose name appeared most frequently in the, if not Newsom, then who discussions, said nothing at all. His office declined to comment. A senior Shapiro advisor, speaking to Politico on background, offered 7 words that contained an entire strategic assessment. "We were not going to touch it. It speaks for itself." In political advisor language, "it speaks for itself" means the damage is comprehensive. Intervention would associate us with the wreckage, and our best strategy is to let the wreckage cool before building on the cleared ground. Pete Buttigieg, asked on a Sunday morning show whether Newsom had been treated fairly, produced a sentence so carefully engineered to avoid both defense and criticism that it deserved study in a communication seminar. Policy debates are a healthy part of the democratic process. The sentence committed to nothing. It criticized no one. It supported no one. It described the hearing as a debate, which normalized it and called it healthy, which endorsed its existence without endorsing its conclusions. It was a masterpiece of saying nothing while appearing to speak. DNC megadonors held what was described to Axios as a temperature check call. The call lasted 4-5 minutes. The participants included 3 major bundlers, 2 PAC directors, and a tech executive who had hosted a Newsom fundraiser 6 months earlier. The temperature was cold. 2 participants used the word wait. 3 used the phrase reassess the timeline. 1 used the word Whitmer. Just the name, no context required. None used the word support in connection with Newsom. In donor language, the absence of the word support after a major public event is the equivalent of a credit downgrade. It doesn't mean the investment is dead. It means the investment has been moved from the growth portfolio to the watch list. The House Oversight Committee, which had been conducting a parallel investigation under the informal heading Empire of Frother at UD, accelerated its document requests within a week of the hearing. Chairman Comer issued subpoenas, not requests, subpoenas, to the California Employment Development Department for comprehensive records of internal loss detection processes during the pandemic. The shift from request to subpoena was a direct consequence of the hearing. Vance's public presentation of the financial loss numbers had given the investigation the political momentum that routine committee work alone could not generate. The public now expected answers. The subpoena was the mechanism for obtaining them. The California State Auditor's Office found itself fielding media inquiries at a volume typically reserved for active scandals rather than annual reports. The high-risk designation of 7 agencies, information that had been publicly available for months, was suddenly being reported as breaking news. The data hadn't changed. The audience had. The California Legislative Analyst's Office released a report on high-speed rail delays and cost overruns. The report had been in preparation for months. These things have their own timelines, independent of political events. But the timing of its release, 2 weeks after the hearing, was noted by every political journalist covering the 2028 race. In Sacramento, timing is never accidental. It is the most sophisticated form of commentary available to nonpartisan institutions. Newsom's 2028 apparatus, the podcast, the early state visits, the donor cultivation, the Davos positioning, did not collapse. Political operations built on years of investment and millions of dollars do not collapse from a single hearing. But they developed a condition that political operatives recognize immediately, and that no amount of messaging, rebranding, or strategic recalibration can cure a timeline problem. A timeline problem is what happens when a candidate's momentum stalls, while the calendar continues to advance. Donors who plan to commit in the spring decide to wait until the fall. Staffers who plan to sign on in June begin returning calls from other campaigns. Pollsters who showed strength begin showing uncertainty. None of these changes is fatal individually. Collectively, they constitute the political equivalent of a slow leak in a tire. Undetectable at highway speed. Catastrophic when you try to stop. A Newsom advisor, speaking anonymously to the Sacramento Bee in a profile piece headlined, "Governor's 2028 Ambitions Face New Math," described the condition with a candor the advisor almost certainly regretted. Before the hearing, we had momentum. After the hearing, we have a timeline problem. And in presidential politics, timeline problems don't resolve themselves. They compound. The podcast. This is Gavin Newsom, which had been the centerpiece of the 2028 media strategy, experienced a ratings decline of 18% in the 2 weeks following the hearing. The irony was structural. The podcast existed to showcase Newsom's communication skills, and the hearing had demonstrated that communication skills without a defensible record were a liability rather than an asset. The better he performed on the podcast, the more viewers were reminded that performance was all he had. At a healthcare event in Sacramento, 3 weeks after the hearing, a reporter asked Newsom about homelessness spending. It was a routine question, the kind he had answered hundreds of times with the rehearsed fluency that was his political signature. The kind of question that usually produced a 4-5-second answer containing the words investment, historic, and fighting for California's future. He began to answer. The numbers actually show he stopped, mid-sentence, mid-breath. The pause lasted 2 seconds, which is a very long time when you are standing at a podium with cameras running. Long enough for every reporter in the room to register that something had changed. He started again, more carefully, with less gloss and more precision. He cited a specific figure, $37 billion, before citing the intent behind it. He acknowledged the increase in homelessness before pivoting to the structural causes. He led with the result before leading with the explanation. It was the first time in 7 years as governor that Gavin Newsom had led a public answer with the number instead of the narrative. The number came first. The narrative came second. The order was reversed from every previous answer he had ever given on the topic, and the reversal was small enough that no one in the room noticed it, except possibly one staffer, who had been with him since the mayoral days, who stood in the back with her arms crossed and her eyebrows slightly raised, watching her boss do something she had been asking him to do for 3 years. On his desk in the governor's office in Sacramento, a large desk, a corner office, The view of Capitol Park through floor-to-ceiling windows. There was a document. Not the resume Vance had marked up. That was in a Reuters archive, and a million screenshots, and the permanent record of the Senate hearing. This was a new document, prepared by his policy staff at his request. Delivered in a manila envelope with no cover note. The heading read, Revised Executive Summary. Governor Gavin Newsom. It was shorter than the original. The language was different. Where the original said led, the revision said oversaw. Where the original said transformed, the revision said initiated. The promises were fewer. The numbers were more prominent. The achievements were described in terms of outcomes rather than intentions. It was not a better document. It was a more honest one. It had been revised 3 times. The margins contained notes in blue ink, a color chosen, perhaps unconsciously, to distinguish them from the red marks that another pen, in another room, had left on another resume 3 weeks earlier. Nobody outside the governor's office knew the document existed. Nobody would. It was not for public consumption. It was for internal use. For the man who would read it late at night, alone, and measure the distance between what he had promised and what he had delivered, and decide whether the distance was bridgeable or permanent. A resume is a summary of accomplishments, but it is also, inevitably, a summary of promises unkept, goals unmet, and numbers unreconciled. And voters, unlike employers, never stop checking references.